All right, so I'm going to tell you the story of Cain and Abel. Now, I really like this story. It's very short. It's only about a paragraph long, which is very interesting because it's one of these examples where it's like a genie, the story. There's so much condensed into it that it's almost unbelievable. And there's even ambiguity condensed into it, which is very, very interesting because it actually makes the story more complex and sophisticated. So let me tell you the story. Now, the first thing, I want to tell you some things about the story first. So we've got the original paradisal state and then the collapse. And so now, metaphysically speaking, we're in the collapse. We're in the post-fall condition. We're still occupying a mythological landscape, right? This isn't history as we normally understand it. It's meta-history. So when we talk about Cain and Abel, we're actually talking about the first two real human beings. Because Adam and Eve, A, were created by God, and B, were in paradise. And so that's not the normative condition of human beings, right? That's a special time that's outside of normal time and space. Cain and Abel, by contrast, they're in history, because in some sense, history actually starts a couple of times in the Old Testament. Right? It starts with the creation of being. It starts with the formation of the garden. It starts with the fall. It starts with Cain and Abel. It starts over again with Noah, and then it starts with Abraham, which is really where what we would recognize more as conventional history begins. So there's a number of starts of history, but this is one of them. Cain and Abel are the first two human beings. Who are they? They're the adversarial brothers. Hero and adversary. They're types of Christ and Satan. It's a well-known supposition. You see that hostile brother motif, well, it's an archetypal motif. And the hostile brothers are the part of you that's striving for the light, that's one half, and the part of you that's embracing the darkness. And so that's part of you. It's part of the social structure, that's Seth and Osiris. It's part of the natural order, in some sense, that's the benevolent and destructive elements of nature. Right? You see that negativity running through all the archetypal representations. But Cain and Abel are the hostile brothers, and Cain is roughly that part of you that says, oh, to hell with it, and means it, right? And that means you'll work for your own pain and destruction, at the same time that you're working for the pain and destruction, not only of your brother, but more particularly of the brother that you admire, because that's actually a lot more entertaining, right? If you're going to become destructive, and you go destroy something bad, that hardly qualifies as destruction. What you want to do is find something great and destroy that. That's destruction. That's revenge. None of this putting punishment where it deserves to be. What you want to do, and this is partly why the story of Christ is archetypal. And an archetypal story is when you cannot push beyond. What's the worst possible punishment? What's the worst possible punishment meted out for the most innocent person? You hit an archetypal end there. So you define most innocent person. You can do that any way you want. Define most innocent person. Define worst possible punishment. Conjoin the two things. You get an archetypal story. And the reason for that is you can't push beyond it. And so if you want to destroy something, you want to destroy an ideal, not something that's flawed. And so Cain and Abel are set up exactly that way. So I'll read you the story and I'll interleave some interpretations along with it. So, and Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bore Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel. And Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. Okay, so Abel's a shepherd, and Cain is a farmer. The shepherd is an archetypal symbol, because the shepherd is the leader of a flock. And the shepherd is the heroic leader of a flock. And the reason this is Middle Eastern mythology, let's say, well, if you were a shepherd, what did you do? You took your slingshot and your stick and you defended your nice, juicy, plump, delicious sheep against lions, right? So it was no joke, man. You were a tough cookie if you were a shepherd, because, well, you were acting as the guardian you were acting as the guardian against predation, roughly speaking, and you weren't armed very well. I mean, well, you can just think about it for a minute. It's to think about fighting off a lion with a slingshot or with a bow and arrow or with a spear. I mean, you have to have a lot of courage to manage that, especially successfully. So Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain was a tiller of the ground, which isn't as heroic a role. And so right off the bat, you get this dichotomy between the two roles. It's also of great interest that Cain is the older brother and Abel is the younger brother. And you see that very frequently in mythology, because the older brother is the one that's privileged by status, right? So he's got privilege, Cain, because he's the elder brother. That also means that if there are possessions to be handed down the generations, the older brother gets them. Now, interestingly enough, Cain has privilege, but he's not the one that's favored by God. And I think that's absolutely brilliant that it's set up that way, because it's actually Abel who doesn't have the right that the firstborn has, who actually turns into the person who's the proper manifestation of the ideal. It's because Cain has things given to him. You might think, well, that's great, he's privileged. What a wonderful thing for Cain. It's like, don't be so sure about that. And partly because one of the things that you'll find, because many of you will be well off when you have children, is one of the problems with being reasonably wealthy when you have children is that you deprive them of privation. Because a lot of what makes people mature is necessity. And if you have, for example, if you have more money than you know what to do with, roughly speaking, it's very difficult to say no to your children when they want something. Because why are you going to say no? You can just provide it. Well, what makes you think that that's what you should do? Well, you can have anything you want. Well, what happens? You devalue what you want, and your desires continue to grow. Well, that's not very helpful. So it's not obvious at all that providing people with an excess, let's say, of privilege is something that's good for them from a psychological perspective. They need to hit the proper limitations. And if you're fortunate, it becomes very difficult to deprive your children properly. So you'll fight with that. It's a big problem. And that's what happens when you get spoiled children, roughly speaking. Right? They get everything by doing nothing. Well, that's not a good lesson, because that won't work in the world. It'll work very counterproductively. And in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering, but unto Cain and his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, angry, and his countenance fell. Okay, so again, there's a tremendous amount packed into that. This is the first time that we see the motif of sacrifice, right? And so I mentioned to you before how these archaic people conceptualized the world, right? It's a dome with a disc of land, and underneath that a disc of water, fresh, and underneath that a disc of salt water. So that's the world. And then up in the heavens, that's where God is. And so God's up in the sky, and we talked about why that might be, and part of that is, well, when you look at the night sky, you look at what transcends your current reality, and you look at what inspires awe. So there's God exists where awe is experienced. Fine. That's a perfectly reasonable hypothesis when you think that what you're trying to do is formulate what constitutes the transcendent. Because if you exist within a conceptual structure and you encounter that which is outside the conceptual structure, you will feel awe. And that's a combination of fear, paralysis, right? And a combination of overwhelming possibility. And you can experience that, for example, if you listen to a great piece of music. What happens? The hair on the back of your neck stands up. Why? Because you're a prey animal and you just puffed up to look bigger. That's why you have that experience. It's piloerection. And it's part of awe. So when you see a cat puff up because a big dog is in front of it, that's what the cat's feeling. It's like, oh my God, puff. Right? So when you encounter that which transcends your limited sphere of apprehension, then you experience awe. You look at the night sky, that's what happens. Music can do that. And all sorts of things that we do can evoke that sense. And so they located the transcendent value in that which inspired awe. Fine, reasonable. Now you can argue about the utility of the personification, right? Because God the Father was personified in human form, but that's a very sophisticated idea too, because as we already found in the Old Testament, there's an association between whatever God is, Yahweh or Elohim, and creating order out of chaos, and something about each individual human being. And so I don't believe that the personification of God the Father in the Old Testament is archaic and primitive at all. I think it's one of the most sophisticated things that people ever developed. The idea is that the ultimate transcendent value is the capacity to generate order out of chaos using linguistic ability, let's say, and that each person has that as an essential element of their being. It's like argue with that, see how far you get. That is one hell of a vicious conceptualization, and I would also say it's the bedrock upon which our legal system rests. So you don't move that easily. You move that and many things fall. And there are things that you may say you don't believe, but you act them out all the time. In fact, if you didn't act them out, people would set you straight very, very rapidly, because basically what other people want from you, even though they don't conceptualize it in these terms, is that you accord them the respect due the incarnation of the logos. That's exactly what it means to interact with someone properly. So you can say what you want about what you believe. It doesn't matter. What matters is what you act out. All right, so now we have this conceptualization of what's transcendent that's emerged as a partially, perhaps as emotional contagion. That which inspires awe is that which is transcendent. And it's associated with these underlying ideas about the creation of order out of chaos and the instantiation of that spirit in human beings. That's all lurking in the background. And then we have this other idea, which we already talked about, which is that there's a patriarchal or paternal spirit that represents the community at large stretched across time. You can think about that as the spirit of the ancestors. So it's the past, it's the present, but that's also projected into the future. That's the thing you bargain with for your life in the future. I'm going to sacrifice myself to get a degree. Why is that? Because the spirit of my culture will reward me in the future. That's the sacrifice. Okay, well, it took people, we were chimpanzees for God's sake. It took us a long time to figure this out. Chimpanzees don't sacrifice the present for the future. You know, you got to ask yourself, how long did it take human beings to figure out that there was a future and then what to do about it? I mean, this isn't something, we didn't go from chimpanzee to fully articulated human being in one step. It was accreted knowledge that was extraordinarily painful. What did we learn from observation? Something like storing up goods for the future helps us live. Imagine how difficult that is, you know. Imagine that you're a farmer back when that was an extraordinarily, you were barely scraping out a living doing that. It was hand to mouth at best. All right, so now it's winter and you've got your damn seeds in your cellar, right? What are you going to do? You're starving. You going to eat them? Or are you going to wait and plant them again in the spring? Because that's your damn choice. And so the people who decided to eat them, well, some of the people who decided to save them died. Well, let's say more of the people who decided to eat them died. And so this sort of knowledge was gathered in unbelievable agony. You don't get what you want right now. For you, that's nothing, because you're very much accustomed to getting what you want all the time right now, roughly speaking, you know, compared to people who live from hand to mouth. But back when things were much rougher, the idea that you had to sacrifice something of value now to be paid off in the future, man, that was a rough thing to accept. Okay, so what happened? So people figured this out somehow. They figured out that you could make an offering of something you valued, and that might help set the world straight. How did they conceptualize that? Well, they conceptualized it ritually. They were acting it out to begin with. It's like the Piagetian idea. You know, when I look at that cup, part of the looking is this, right? It's the adjustment of my body to the shape of the cup. That's part of my understanding. Well, one of Piaget's great observations is that we use our bodies to represent things long before we understand what it is that we're representing, which is to say no more than we act things out. We're dramatic creatures, right? We use drama. And the sacrificial ritual is a drama that points to a higher psychological truth. And the higher psychological truth is let go of what you value now, and perhaps that will pay off manifold in the future. You're making a bargain. And then you might say, well, who are you making a bargain with? And you could say, well, nature. But that's not exactly right. It's not exactly right, because let's say I have something of value in a social organization. And I'm going to let it go because I'm relying on a corresponding reward or a greater reward in the future. It's a contractual relationship with other people. It's not a relationship with nature. It's that we've organized ourselves into a social structure, and we're willing to maintain the integrity of the social structure across time so that if I give up something now, I can be paid for it in the future. And the deal is, we're going to try to keep the future the same as the present so that those contracts can be met in the future. That's money. That's what money is, right? Here's some money. You made a sacrifice. That's why you get the money. What does the money signify? It's a promise from the community that the labor that you invested can be stored and then brought forward for your own purposes in the future. So it's actually part of the social contract. So the thing you're sacrificing to is the spirit of society that produces the social contract. And so that's conceptualized as God the Father. Well, how else would you conceptualize it? It's the spirit of the dominance hierarchy. That's the right way to think about it. So it's what's common across all the members of the dominance hierarchy across time. Well, it's something you can negotiate with, true or not. What the hell do you think you're doing when you make a contract? What's the law? It's all of this. It's the manifestation of that patriarchal spirit across time and space. And what do? You sacrifice to it. Well, so back 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, however old this story is, it's probably older than that. This is the best people could do with regards to realization. And they got it quite right, because they also noted that God was happier if you actually sacrificed something of value. And so there's a tremendous complexity in that idea, because one of the things I could say, and this is something Jung pointed out, let's say you're miserable and unhappy. Okay, here's a cure. Find what's valuable and let it go. So we could say, well, maybe it's a relationship that you have. Maybe it's a relationship with your parents, right? And the relationship is pathological, but you're locked into it. You value it. And no wonder, because it's a relationship with your parents. And you're suffering terribly because of it. Well, what do? Maybe you let it go. It's a sacrifice. And the idea is that, well, that'll clear the future for you. Well, very frequently when people are suffering terribly, not always, because sometimes you just suffer stupidly, blindly, and without recourse. You get cancer and then you die. So we have no idea how to deal with that. But sometimes the reason that you're suffering is because you just won't let go of the thing that's biting you. And you think, well, I can't let go of, and I've had clients like this. I can't stop communicating with my mother, who phones me 3 times a day, every day of my life, and never says anything that isn't unbelievably critical and demeaning. I can't let that go. It's like, well, that's not such a good idea. The funny thing too, often when people let something like that go, it goes away, sorts itself out, and then comes back. So they don't even end up losing it. But unless they're willing to let it go, to sacrifice it, they make no headway whatsoever. And so one of the rules is, if people are impeding your development, you sacrifice your relationship with them, right? It's a very, very rough rule. So, in process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of the fat thereof. Now that's interesting, eh? This is where a close reading matters. So we don't know what Cain's offering is. It's not much described. But we do know something about Abel's offering. And what we know is that by the standards of the time, it's a high quality offering. So it's the firstborn and it's the fat, that high calorie, right? I mean, we think of fat as a dietary danger, but if you're hungry, that's really wrong, right? Because fat is unbelievably high calorie. And so what's happening is, the story points out quite clearly that what Abel decides to offer to God is of high quality. So it's the real thing. It's the real thing. He's paying a price. Okay, and so then it's burned. Well, why is it burned? Well, this is back again thinking from an archaic perspective. Well, God's in the sky. You can't throw your lamb up into the sky. It'll just fall back down. And so, but people knew, because they'd mastered fire, that smoke and savor rose. And so you could detect the quality of an offering as a consequence of burning. And then that would go up, in the spirit of the fire would go up to the sky, and God could detect whether or not your offering was of reasonable quality. It's concretized, obviously, but you don't want to make the assumption that the people who were our forebears were stupid just because they thought using metaphors that aren't the same as our metaphors. They were still mapping out the damn territory, and you look, you can read a book like you're above the authors of the book, or you can read a book as if it might have something to teach you. And I would say, well, sometimes the book isn't worth reading. But if a book has been around for a very long period of time and a very large number of people have thought that perhaps there's something in it, sometimes they're right. So, and it's a tricky thing, and it might also depend on how you read it. But I found that this sort of investigation was a lot more useful if I started from the presupposition that maybe there was something I didn't know. Instead of, you know, so funny. For example, I taught a first-year course about 10 years ago on the psychology of religion. And it was so interesting dealing with the 18-year-old students because they were completely dismissive of religious ideas. And I thought, God, you guys, you don't know anything. And you have this specific kind of blindness that a set of very intelligent social psychologists also identified, which was blindness. Because it actually turns out that the less you know about a topic, the more you overestimate the quality of your knowledge. And so I thought, we're in this situation where kids who don't even know how to act in the world, they don't know anything, will come to university and start off with the proposition that they're astute critics of Judeo-Christian culture, of which they know nothing. They know nothing about it. They know nothing about history. They know nothing about philosophy, nothing about literature, but they're absolutely certain that they're correct in the criticisms that they're bringing forth. It's absolutely unbelievable. So anyways, and it's not helpful because then you don't get to learn. And you want, well, you know what happens if you don't learn. Okay, so anyway, so it looks like Abel's doing a good job. That's the implication. The story doesn't say Abel is doing a really good job with his sacrifices. It just hints at it. And I like that because it leaves that ambiguity. It's like maybe you're working really hard and your brother's working really hard and you really can't tell the difference between your quality of work and his quality of work. But for some reason he's succeeding like mad. That happens, right? Because there's an arbitrary element to life. And so the story says, well, the Lord has respect unto Abel and his offering, and there's an implication that maybe the reason for that is that, you know, Cain's offerings are a little second rate, but the story doesn't come out and club you over the head with that idea. It just leaves it as an ambiguous possibility. And the reason for that is sometimes you make sacrifices and maybe they're even real ones and they don't pay off, or they pay off for someone better. And so there is this arbitrary nature of the transcendent that you're attempting to deal with. It rewards and doesn't reward more or less of its own accord. Or there's an element of that. And so it's ambiguous in the text, even though there's a hint that, you know, perhaps Abel is doing a better job than Cain. So I like that. I think it's very sophisticated. So what happens? Well, Cain makes his offerings and God isn't happy with them. Now we don't know how Cain figures out that God isn't happy with his offerings. We get some hints of that too, but the story does tell us that's what happens. And so then we get the psychological response on the part of Cain. Now one response could be, Jesus, I must be doing something wrong. I better straighten myself out. You know, I better come up with a better quality offering and try that again. That isn't what happens. What happens instead is that Cain becomes angry, wroth, and his countenance falls. And so what does that mean? It means this, right? It means he is not happy. He's angry and out for revenge. And so I've been thinking about this a lot lately with regards to the literature on inequality. Because there's a very good literature that shows, for example, that there's a measure called the Gini coefficient. And the Gini coefficient is a numerical index of the relative inequality of a geographical locale. So for example, if you went to Newfoundland, where everyone is roughly not very rich, or North Dakota, say, almost everyone there is, say, lower middle class, something like that, or upper working class, something like that. Very little variability, low Gini coefficient, okay? And if you go to Miami Beach, say, where everyone's rich, low Gini coefficient, because it isn't an index of absolute wealth or absolute poverty, it's an index of relative poverty. And so if everyone's rich, the relative poverty is low, and if everyone's poor, the relative poverty is low. Now, one question is, where's the crime? And you might think, well, the crime is where the absolute poverty is high, right? Or the absolute wealth is low. That's where the crime is. Well, that's wrong. If things are relatively distributed in an egalitarian manner, the male-on-male crime, especially homicide, is low. And it's also the case where everyone is rich. But if you go into places where there's some rich people, but not very many, and there's a lot of people who are comparatively poor, then the male homicide rates and violent crime rates amp up substantially. And it's a consequence of male-on-male competition. And so what you could derive from that, and maybe even reasonably, is that you should flatten out the damn income distribution because you're destabilizing the society by facilitating male criminal aggression. You can make a good case for that. in places like Colombia, where the Gini coefficient got unbelievably extreme, society got so violent that it could barely hold itself together. So you can make a conservative argument for redistribution of income, using the observation that if the income distribution gets too extreme, the whole bloody thing starts to destabilize and might fall. But then you also might say, well, wait a minute, is it inequality that's driving the violence? Or is it resentment of the inequality that's driving the violence? Now that's a tough question, because you might say, well, what if the game is rigged and there's no way of moving up the power hierarchy? Well, then maybe anger and the desire for revolution is the appropriate response. But that doesn't really mean to me that the response should be the sort of thing that you see in high Gini coefficient neighborhoods, which is intraracial violence between men. So for example, in neighborhoods where there's high murder rates, the murders are always between young men, and they're always within race. And so that doesn't seem to me to be exactly a politically revolutionary move, right? It's more like violent competition for the sake of attaining status. And you might say, well, that's reasonable, but because the inequality is there and men need to find status because it's part of what drives them forward, it's part of what makes them attractive to women, it's a necessity. Well, the question is, do you attain status through destruction? Or do you start making your offerings, putting your offerings in order? And that's something we really need to figure out, because that's a fundamental political question. It's a fundamental political question. Anyways, what happens in this story is that Cain decides that the fact that God isn't accepting his offerings means that he's entitled to become angry and negative. Those two things are both put together, right? He's wroth, he's angry, and he's also depressed. And so he's in a state of mind that, well, I think the best characterization for that is hostile resentment, because it's unfair. It's like, yeah, it's unfair. So what are you going to do about it? You're going to get destructive about it? Or are you going to change your approach? Well, Cain, he does the ultimate thing, and this is what people do when they do the ultimate thing, because that kind of hostile resentment has an archetypal endpoint. And the archetypal endpoint is the point that you get when you're hostile and resentful because you haven't been successful. And then you go sit in your mother's basement for about 10 years. And then you start imagining just how nice it would be if you shot up the local high school so that everybody knew your name. And what happens is you go from, I'm irritated because things aren't working out for me very well, to I'm irritated and I hate those people for whom things are working out well, to I'm irritated and I hate the fact that the world is set up so that this has happened to me. And then you go to, well, because I'm irritated and hate the world, I'm going to do whatever I can that will destroy it most rapidly and with the highest possible amount of pain and suffering conceivable. And at that point, then you don't just go shoot up the high school, you go up and shoot up the elementary school. And so if you're wondering what kind of pathway people walk down to get to that point, that's the pathway. And the ultimate cap of that is, well, I'll kill the kids because, well, we already know that killing the innocent is a lot more effective than killing the guilty. And then just to cap it off, I'll blow my head off at the end just to show you just how goddamn pointless it all is. And so that's the logical extension of Cain's attitude. And you might think, well, that's a bit of an overreading. And I will say it's not an overreading at all. It's exactly what happens in the text. So it's exactly what follows it. So fine. So Cain is not happy. And so who's he not happy with? Well, he's not happy with God. And so what does that mean? Well, we've already unpacked this. He's not happy with the social contract, because that's part of the spirit, the patriarchal spirit, let's say. And then there's more to it than that, because we've already analyzed what God, the idea of God might represent in the background of this story. He's not happy with the transcendent. He's not happy with the idea of the logos, all of that. No faith in the transcendent. Nothing but, he does nothing but despise the social contract. And he's got no faith whatsoever in the logos, let's say, the word that brings chaos out of order. He's got nothing but contempt for all of that. And, you know, certainly you know people like that. And if you don't know them, you just go on YouTube and read the comments, and you'll see all sorts of people like that. So anyways, so God has a little chat with him, and he says, well, why are you angry? And why are you upset? And Cain says, and God says, if you do well, won't you be accepted? And if you don't do well, sin lies at your door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. Okay, that's a very mangled translation, I would say. So I'm going to take it apart. So what God says is, well, you're angry and you're upset. It's like, well, what's your problem? And then God tells Cain, if you did things properly, they would work out for you. Well, it's the last thing he wants to hear, because what Cain wants to believe is that the reason he's not doing very well is because there's no sense having any faith in the logos. The transcendent is evil and aimed exactly against him, and the entire social contract is faulty. That's what he wants to hear, but that isn't what God says. God says, well, wait a minute. Maybe you're doing something wrong. Well, that's maybe a worse message than everything else is corrupt. It's like, you're having a problem because you're just not everything you could be. Well, and then God says something really nasty, and you can't tell from this lines. I read a bunch of translations to try to figure out exactly what it meant. So this is what God tells Cain. He says, you're in a room in a house, and there's something at the door. And he uses a metaphor. God uses a metaphor. It's a sexually aroused predatory cat. And you invite it in. You invite it in. You know that it has evil intent. You invite it in to mate with you, right? And its union with you, this malevolent force, its sexual union with you, has produced an offspring. And that offspring is what possesses you. And so not only have you done something wrong, you've invited the spirit of wrongdoing into your life, and you've creatively intermingled it with it voluntarily to bring forth a monster of your own creation. So that's what God tells Cain. It's like, look, it's bad enough that God says, you should get your act together, because maybe that's why things aren't going so well for you. Before you criticize the transcendent and the world and the structure of being, maybe you're doing something wrong. But it's worse than that. He says, not only are you doing something wrong, you bloody well know you're doing something wrong, and you're doing it creatively and with intent. So not only are things not going well for you, but you've played a creative role in producing that situation. And so God basically says, I am taking zero responsibility for rejecting your sacrifice. It's all on you. And so Cain leaves, and he's like seriously not happy with that response, because he wanted to hear, pat, pat, you're a victim of circumstance and everything's conspiring against you, and really, being God, I should get my act together and just give you what you want, because obviously, being God, I'm wrong and you're right. Well, that isn't what happens. It's exactly the opposite of that. It's completely on you. That's the judgment. And so Cain leaves, and believe me, he was wroth before, and his countenance had fallen before, but it's nothing like it is now. And so he hits the next stage, and he thinks, okay, I'm going to take my revenge. What am I going to do? I'm going to find the most innocent and worthwhile thing that's favored of God, and I'm going to kill it. And that's what he does. So, and it doesn't matter that it's his brother. And Abel, we're drawing the inference, Abel's done the right things, everyone likes him, everything's flourishing for Abel, he's a good guy. He's one of those people that you meet that has everything, and then you meet them and you wish you could hate them, but you can't, because they're really good people, and then you really hate them. Because not only do they have everything, but it appears that they deserve it. And there's nothing that sort of sits in your soul and rots it more than that realization. And so that's the situation with Cain. And so Cain thinks, Cain talked with Abel his brother, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. So that's so interesting, because look what happens to Cain here. So he's not doing well. He's separated from the transcendent and from society. He's bitterly resentful. And now he goes out and kills the very thing that he most wants to be. So he destroys his own ideal, right? He demolishes his own ideal. That's how far his resentment has pushed him. And so he's done, right? But it doesn't matter, because it enables him to take revenge. So he doesn't care. It's like the suicidal school shooter that blows off his head at the end of his mayhem. It's like, it doesn't matter to him. It's part of the same art form. And the Lord says unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? And Cain said, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, that's a good question. That's why it's posed in the story, because the answer to that is supposed to be yes. And God says, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries unto me from the ground. That's actually the motif that Dostoevsky explores, I would say, in Crime and Punishment, because what happens is that Raskolnikov is Cain, for all intents and purposes, and he commits a murder. But he gets away with it. Well, so he thinks. So he thinks. No one suspects him. He buries the money. He can't stand to touch the money. He buries it in an abandoned lot, and he's drawn there now and then to look at where it is, but he can't touch it, because the money it's so funny because the money before he kills the pawnbroker is not the same as the money after he kills the pawnbroker. And the Raskolnikov before he kills the pawnbroker is not the same as the Raskolnikov after he kills the pawnbroker. In fact, they're not the same at all. And so Raskolnikov is tormented by God, you could say, but not from the external world. He sets the crime up quite nicely. It's that the spirit against which he transgressed tortures him from within. And there's no escape from it. And so eventually what happens in Crime and Punishment is Raskolnikov continues to manifest himself as guilty in every possible way until he receives the punishment that he desires, because it's the only way that he can set things right. He essentially turns himself in, eventually, because he can't tolerate what he's done. So that's the idea. Thy voice of thy brother's blood cries unto me from the ground. It's guilt. And now you're cursed from the earth, which has opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. When you till the ground, it will not henceforth yield unto you its strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shall thou be in the earth. You know, and you might say, well, why does God not just strike Cain dead? And the answer to that perhaps is that wouldn't be sufficient punishment. And that's what it looks like to me. It's like, what's the punishment? You live with what you did. Right? And I don't want anybody taking you out either, because then you won't have to live with what you did. So that's the punishment. And Cain says unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. It's like, yeah. Behold, you have driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. That's the same as what happens to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Remember, Adam hides from God, and he has his reasons. And now Cain is alienated from God. There's no reconstructing that relationship. He's put himself, by violating his contract, let's say, with the transcendent, and also with society, and also with his own spirit, he's put himself outside the possibility of redemption. And that's why he says, the punishment is greater than I can bear. There's no hope left, right? So he's in hell for all intents and purposes. Behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid, and I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth. And it shall come to pass that everyone who finds me will kill me. And God says, therefore whoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark unto Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. Now that's interesting. You think, why in the world would God protect Cain? Well, the next part of the story actually tells you that. You have a family, I have a family. Your brother kills my son. So what do? I come and I kill your father and your cousin. And then you think, well, I killed your father and your cousin. I'm going to come back and I'm going to kill 4 of your people. And then I come back and say, yeah, no problem. It's 16 of you this time. And then you come back and you say, 16, eh? Let's try for 32. And so this is what happens. This is actually why justice systems are set up, by the way. There's a bunch of reasons justice systems are set up. And one is to punish the guilty. That's one. The other is to have the guilty repent. That's 2. To maintain social order. That's 3. Here's another one that no one ever thinks about. Back 30 years ago, the governor of Massachusetts, whose name I forget, was running for president. And while he was governor of Massachusetts, he had released a number of prisoners, one of whom's name was, I think, Willie, maybe Horton. Doesn't really matter. And when Willie was released on this program, he went out and raped someone and perhaps killed them. I can't remember, but it doesn't matter. The rape is good enough. And the governor was asked during a debate what he would do if a released prisoner had raped his daughter or his wife. And he gave a very weak answer. What was his name? He gave a very weak answer of something about, letting the law take its due course. And that's the wrong answer, right? The right answer is, I would be compelled with every fiber of my being to hunt that person down and to tear him into bits. But I won't do it. Now, what's the purpose of the justice system? It's to alleviate you from the responsibility of revenge. That's what it's for. Because otherwise, what happens? You kill 1, I kill 2. You kill 4, I kill 8. You kill 16. And soon, everyone's at war. And so God protects Cain to stop that from happening, to stop the feud from emerging, because those things can go forever, and then from transforming the entire society into a state of war. And so what's also, so I'll tell you the rest of the story. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bare Enoch, etc. So now you have a genealogy, right? So Cain starts to have a family. You have a genealogy. And so a number of people are named in the lineage. And it tells you what, this is sort of an attempt to describe how things came about. So this is like the naming of the heroes of old. And so you have Enoch, who builds a city. You have Jabal, who is the father of those who dwell in tents and of those who have cattle. You have Jubal, who is the father of musicians, and Zillah, who bore Tubal-Cain. Now, Tubal-Cain is a very interesting person. By tradition, Tubal-Cain is the first artificer of weapons of war. So Cain's descendant, after multiple generations, is the person who produces weapons of war. All right, and so there's another bit of the story within which that needs to be placed in context. And Lamech, who's one of the grandchildren of Cain, says unto his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech, hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. Okay, so what he's saying is, he's been involved in a murder. If Cain be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. And so there's the implication there that the tit-for-tat process has begun. Cain kills Abel. Cain's children kill 7. Cain's grandchildren kill 70-fold. And then Tubal-Cain pops up on the horizon, and he's the person who makes artifices of war. And so the story, in its fragmentary manner, ties the individual psychopathology that's resentful and revenge-seeking to the proclivity for broad-scale warfare. And this really hit me because I was interested particularly in what was happening in the Nazi camps with the guards. Because the guards were gratuitously cruel. And I was very curious about that. And so here's an interesting story. This was in a book called Ordinary Germans, Hitler's Willing Executioners. And it was a book that was written about 30 years ago that challenged the idea that the Nazi phenomena was top-down order following, which I don't believe, by the way. I think that that's a very weak hypothesis. Fascistic societies are fascistic at every single level of organization. Spiritually, within the family, within the local community, it's like a holograph. It's the same absolutely everywhere. It's not top-down. I mean, there are leaders who get produced and maybe they catalyze it, but to blame it on the leaders is to forget about the process by which the leaders come to be. So, no, you don't get a pass that way. So here's one of the things that happened. As the Nazis started to lose the war. So here's what you should have done if you were a Nazi and you wanted to win the war. You should have enslaved the Jews and the Gypsies and had them work, right? You should have had them work for the benefit of the victory. And then if you wanted to, you liquidate them afterwards. That's the logical thing to do if you want to win. And we assume that Hitler wanted to win. But that's not a very intelligent assumption. Why would you assume that? He wasn't exactly a good guy. So why should we assume that he was aiming at the good that he was promoting, even in his own terms, right? The glorious, everlasting Third Reich, right? That'll rule for 1,000 years and be a bastion of civilization and music, because that's the sort of thing he purported to be interested in. Well, so what do you do with the Jews and the Gypsies? Well, round them up, fine. Enslave them, fine. You don't kill them. You certainly don't devote a substantial proportion of your war resources while you're losing to accelerate the rate at which the extermination is taking place. Because that's a bit counterproductive, unless what you're aiming at is the maximum possible mayhem in the shortest period of time. Well, so what happened as the Germans started to lose the war? Did Hitler lose faith in his own ability? No, he believed that the Germans had betrayed him with weakness. And so he was perfectly willing to accelerate the rate at which Germany was losing the war. And so when Hitler and his minions had the choice, here's the choice. You can suspend your unnecessary demolition of people, win the damn war, and then pick it up afterwards. Or while you're losing, you can just accelerate the mayhem even though it's counterproductive. It's like, what'd they pick? Well, they pick to accelerate the mayhem. And so to me, there's an old psychoanalytic idea. I think this was derived by Jung. If you can't figure out what someone is doing or why, look at the outcome and infer the motivation. If it produces mayhem, perhaps it was aiming at mayhem. Now, you have to use that dictum carefully. If someone's irritating you, maybe it's because you're irritable and you should sort yourself out, but maybe it's because they're actually aiming at irritating you. And that's the actual motivation. So perhaps not, but it's another tool in your analytical armament. So, and so you see, well, and this is the thing about warfare that's so interesting about because you can attribute it to territoriality. You can attribute it to a war for resources. That's what I would say, wretchedly simple-minded economists presume people fight over scarce resources. It's like, hey, we're a little bit more sophisticated than that. And first of all, what resources are you talking about? The bloody Inuit had nothing. They lived perfectly well. What did they have? Snow and seal blubber. People can live in unbelievably deprived conditions. And so the idea that there are natural resources that we fight over because there's a shortage of them is a pretty oversimplified view of human beings. It's like, well, why do people fight? Well, maybe they fight sometimes for good reasons, but very, very frequently they fight for bad reasons. And those bad reasons are personal as well as sociocultural and economic. If you were a Nazi prison guard, for example, whatever pathologies you were carrying around in your destructive little soul, whatever element of Cain was deeply embedded in you, had the opportunity to be manifest fully at every moment of your waking existence, right? You had these people who were completely beholden to you, with no rights whatsoever, to whom you could do whatever your evil little heart determined. Think, well, maybe that was a motivation for putting them there to begin with. And all the cover story about, well, we're trying to build the Third Reich and we're trying to stabilize the state and we're trying to do all these good things. Maybe that's just a cover story for the real motivation, which is nothing but what? The construction of death camps that killed 6 million people. How about that? And the obliteration of 120 million people on the planet, and the leaving of Europe in ruins. Maybe that was the motivation. Or are we going to attribute to Hitler the highest possible motives? Say, no, it's an archetypal manifestation of Cain. Now, he's going to put up a front that says, well, I'm your savior. It's like, well, destructive people think that Cain is their savior.